Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Can you guys hear me? It says we're live, so I'm going to believe you. Welcome. Hello. Happy Sunday evening. Very excited to have with us a repeat offender. Ooh, no pun intended. Repeat guest, Alex Vitale, who is a professor of sociology at Brooklyn College. He's also the author of The End of Policing, and he's the coordinator of the
Policing and Social Justice Project.
Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College. And great book. I always refer to you whenever these discussions come up. So thank you so much for joining us.
You bet, Katie.
What are you drinking? Because I know we're going to talk about heavy stuff, but you got to self-medicate.
Well, that was water, but I did pour myself a little scotch and water to help ease the pain.
Yeah.
No, ease through the evening here.
Yeah.
It's Sunday night. It's been a long week. Got another one coming up.
Yeah. Again, thank you so much, because I know I've seen you. You're on all these podcasts and radio shows and television. You really, when I interviewed you a couple years ago for the first time, I thought that your work was really important. I was really excited by it. Did you know? I felt like it's not like I thought it was a work of science fiction, but I did think it was more future oriented, than I do now. Are you surprised by the way? Well, have things shifted as much as they seem that they have?
Well, that's a good question, right? Because it's not so obvious what the immediate results of all this are going to be. While we've had a couple of very concrete victories, $100 million here, the end of school policing there, we're up against some very powerful forces who continue to think that the problems of policing can be fixed with some implicit bias training and firing a few police officers. And really, the policing, our over-reliance on policing is directly connected to our unwillingness to do anything about problems of mass homelessness, mass untreated mental illness, mass economic precarity. So that means the politicians who don't want to deal with those things, all they can offer us is a bunch of superficial procedural reforms and kind of throw a few officers under the bus. And if you watch like CNN and MSNBC, what you see is them just trotting out one person after another talking about body cameras and implicit bias training. And, once every 24 hours, a voice gets in there and says something, well, maybe they shouldn't be doing every job under the sun, but it's really few and far between.
Right. And, did you, when you started writing this book, The End of Policing, did you discover anything? Did you go into it basically with all the ideas and takes and perspectives that you had coming out of it? Or did anything surprise you? Did anything change your mind?
Well, I don't know about change my mind, but I definitely learned some stuff, especially the history. I had a general sense of some broad outlines thanks to Christian Williams's book, Our Enemies in Blue, and also there was an activist intervention in the early 1970s that produced this document called The Iron Fist and the Velvet Glove, mm-hmm. that really gave a kind of opening salvo of this kind of analysis that policing is not going to be reformed. It's structurally oppressive, et cetera. But, I went down to Charleston, South Carolina, which some people had sort of mentioned was interesting in this regard, and learned a lot firsthand about the ways in which, slavery in the big cities looked very different than slavery in the countryside. So that a lot of people are somewhat familiar with this idea of plantations and overseers and maybe even slave patrols, patrollers who would patrol these rural highways and byways looking for slaves who didn't have permission to be out on the roads. But in the cities, it was very different, because actually slaves worked outside the home of their owners for wages that were then returned to the owners. And this meant that in the big cities like Charleston and Savannah and New Orleans, which were really big cities back then, we're talking even in the late 1700s and early 1800s, there were often more black slaves than there were whites. And so this created a real public order problem of potential slave revolts, slaves learning how to read, underground societies. So they basically create modern forms of policing to lawfully, professionally manage this slave population. And so that was like a kind of powerful thing to sort of go and visit some of these historic homes and see the slave quarters, and then read about the badges that they had to wear when traveling from where they lived to where they worked, etc.
And can you share with listeners, in case they don't know, about the British origins of the police and why they're called bobbies in England? And then
yeah. So there's a kind of the standard academic narrative about the origins of policing is that it begins in 1829 with the formation of the London Metropolitan Police. They're held up as the first sort of civilian, professional, uniform, 24-hour, non-military, response to crime and disorder. And the history just sort of says, well, Sir Robert Peel, who created them, Robert, Bob, the Bobbies, right, was some genius who just drew this out of thin air. But what's left out of that typical kind of liberal academic narrative is that he got this idea when he was in charge of the English occupation of Ireland. He was a colonial manager. And during that period that he was doing it, England's army was tied up with Napoleon, and he was low on forces of repression. And so he invents the Irish Peace Preservation Force. And to make it more nimble, more affordable, and more legitimate, he tries to embed them in local communities and give them this kind of law enforcement patina. And this allows them to act preemptively when uprisings of different kinds are brewing, so-called agricultural outrages, which were really, peasant revolts against landlords. But Peel takes this idea and brings it to the urban setting of London during this period where there's this massive influx of folks coming from the countryside because of the enclosures. They're losing their agricultural jobs, and they're hoping to find work in the city in this newly industrializing economy. And Neil Klaus argues, he's a British social theorist about policing. He argues that basically policing is created to manufacture a working class, to take this disorderly, rebellious, rural population that's angry about economic change and mold them into a reliable working class that will not make too much trouble, that won't have bread riots, that won't commit crime, and that won't organize strikes and be disruptive to the economy.
So like a white working class, would you say?
Yeah, it's white, although, there are Irish immigrants in this period, and their racial status is more complicated, but this is really before there's any meaningful presence of folks from the West Indies or parts of Africa. So you're talking about an overwhelmingly white working class population. Yeah. So it's interesting. It's not, in the American context, like Charleston, like the Texas Rangers, who were our own colonial police, there's a clear racial capitalism at work. But see, the British were able to export their racial exploitation. It takes place in India, in the West Indies, in Africa, and the economic exploitation at home is not racialized in that way. It's given a very profound class character. Right. So the idea is that these people are inferior because of class breeding, right? So the upper class deserves their position because they have proper breeding, and the lower class, they don't know any better. They can't manage their own affairs. So it's very paternalistic kind of class-based society.
Right. So what is happening now? And were you surprised? I mean, because there's all this, like you said, there's a lot of discussion about abolish the police, defund the police, disband the police. And as I heard you on CNN, you said that these things are much more complicated than just a tweet or a slogan. But it does seem like there's power in rhetoric, and it can be, we have to be vigilant, right? Because we can't let people just hide behind slogans without meaningful policy. But were you surprised by how much this word abolish the police or defund the police has been kind of not normalized, but how it's no longer as radical a term as it was just a few years ago, I think. Did you expect that? Or
so I mean, I didn't expect it to the extent that it has been, this universal call, but it was not completely a surprise, because for the last 3 years, I've been crisscrossing the country every other week. I'm in like 25 cities a week. And so I've been doing, support for this organizing that's happening all over the place. I mean, I was in 3 cities in Indiana earlier this year. I've been all over Texas. It's not just LA, New York, San Francisco, right? There's this national thing percolating, and people were doing this work on the ground in places like Nashville, Tennessee, and Durham, and Dallas, and not your normal hotbeds of liberal activism, right. Much less radical activism. And so what I saw over that 3 years was just the extent to which the narrative had really shifted to let's say maybe a more abolitionist orientation, or a fully abolitionist orientation. So for instance, in St. Louis and Ferguson, and I've spent a fair amount of time down there because they keep asking me back. Initially, the response in Ferguson was, jail killer cops. That's what we want. That's justice. That's accountability. But over time, you begin to see among the activists the understanding that that's not actually going to get them where they want to be. It's not really going to change policing, and it's certainly not going to change the conditions in their communities. So folks like Derica Purnell, who was part of that movement and is now one of the really important thought leaders in what's going on today, she eventually writes a piece for The Guardian about that jailing killer cops is a dead-end strategy. And so then people start deepening their analysis, and eventually you get the Close the Workhouse campaign, which is about closing a jail and redirecting those resources into community identified needs. And they're out working in the neighborhoods, building support for this idea, pressuring local city council members, getting op-eds in the newspaper, showing up at budget hearings. And that's what this new movement looks like. It's a really very practical local politics with some very concrete demands. And defund the police to them always means reinvest in these community identified needs. And that's the one, I would say, weakness of the defund the police hashtag, is that it doesn't capture that reinvest part. It doesn't quite capture this idea that actually we have a better plan for creating safe communities. It's right. Not tomorrow there are just no police, right? It's that we want to build up these alternative infrastructures because we think they'll do a better job of keeping people safe.
Right. Yeah. How much of a kind of bipartisan or post-partisan consensus is there around this? Because I'm always surprised by how much, or maybe not surprised, but it does seem like even people who aren't particularly empathetic, progressive, caring people, but are fiscal conservatives and public safety people, slowly but surely, and I don't know about the data, this is purely anecdotal, but people seem to be getting more and more that if you care about keeping people safe, this kind of more draconian punitive justice is not actually effective. It costs a lot of money and it doesn't keep people safe. How much of a shift are we seeing in terms of people who aren't particularly progressive? Is that shifting among people who identify as conservatives or tough on crime, or is that still kind of
it's interesting because most of the attention had been on prisons. So like when the abolitionist movement kind of really takes on some legs about 20 something years ago with the formation of critical resistance and the emergence of works by people like Ruth Wilson Gilmore and stuff, the focus is almost entirely on prisons and mass incarceration. So we get the new Jim Crow, right, from Michelle Alexander, that doesn't say anything about police. And so that movement has been making some real progress, but the focus has always been on reducing the number of people in prison.
Right. And
so actually one of the major motivations for me to write the book was to say, hey, police, right? Nobody ends up in prison without going through the police first. And B, police commit a tremendous amount of harm even when they don't send people to prison, right? The constant harassment,
right.
The demeaning behavior, and they actually kill people.
Right. So
the bipartisanship has emerged a little bit around incarceration.
Mm-hmm.
There's more openness, especially at the federal level, to say, yes, there are too many people in prison and we need alternatives. Now, the problem is that sometimes they want to replace prisons with electronic monitoring and other forms of intensive surveillance, which is also very problematic. But that bipartisan consensus is thin. The reforms have been very thin, right on crime kind of stuff, but it's there. But not on policing.
Right. Okay. So I'm more on incarceration than on policing. Right. That makes sense.
Yes. If you just look at the bills that are being discussed in Washington, right, it's just a return to these superficial procedural reforms and a couple of kind of harm reduction measures, and not a word about reducing the scope of policing, which has to be, the center of the agenda, and of course is the center of the defund movement.
Right.
So there's so little mainstream political support in Washington for these ideas right now.
Right. Yeah, I mean, right. So that's an important distinction. You're right. I was just lumping all of it in together because there's the carceral state, incarceration, and then there's actual policing. Right.
Yeah. I mean, we may see this all as the carceral state, but in terms of actual public policy, it's not understood that way.
Exactly right. And of course, people who are not on the left don't run around using the word carceral state, obviously, or outside of academia. Yeah. So what is happening now? What does it mean? Let's start with the basics. What exactly demilitarizing, defunding, and disbanding the police, and then abolish the police? What all of these mean? I know, like going from the most.
We'll have a little glossary here.
Yeah.
So, and in fact, that reminds me, Policing a Field Guide is a great resource on this. I got my little stack of books here by Tyler Wall and David Correa, which is basically a glossary of terms of cop speak and whatnot. So,
cool.
So defund the police is, in its simplest terms, it's about taking money from policing and shifting it to communities. And ideally, it involves the dismantling of specific policing tasks that would then be accomplished by community-based interventions. Dismantling the police means something a little bit different, and there's a lot less clarity about that. We had one example of this in Camden, New Jersey, but that was really primarily about breaking the union so that they could bring in a new force at lower pay with no work rules, no union, and then that led to actually more intensive policing. with a lot of kind of procedural niceties for the community. What's being talked about in Minneapolis is much more like what the defund folks are asking for, which is that they are saying, the latest I've heard is this discussion of, we're going to do community consultations to identify people's specific public safety needs. And then we're going to work with the community to come up with as many non-police-based strategies for addressing those as we can. And at the end of that process, we'll be able to significantly shrink the footprint of policing and shift those resources into community need, community infrastructures, alternative. So in my mind, that's exactly what we should be doing. It's incredibly exciting. Now, it's going to take work to hold their feet to the fire and make them really do it. It's going to take work to identify best practices.
They're trotters. Sorry, I had to.
Yes.
I love pigs.
Well, it's
by
not
the way,
the police.
I'm very upset. Okay, I just wanted to interject.
It's not the police. It's the city council members.
City council members.
City council members. That's who has to be held accountable here.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to use that term because I wanted to. We'll put a pin in it. I love pigs, so I'm very uncomfortable with the porcophobic terminology. But anyway.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Which doesn't even apply because you weren't even talking about them. That was just putting a pin on the pigtail, on the tail of the pig. Yeah. Yeah.
And then I think the last one you mentioned was abolish the police. So abolition takes the defund analysis more deeply. They're not mutually exclusive.
I'm sorry, one second. When you said defund and dismantle, are those the same terms?
No, not at all. Not at all. So dismantle implies changing the personnel usually.
Okay. So
it can look like defund in Minneapolis, but in other cases, it's looked like something very different.
Okay.
So we got to be careful about dismantle. We don't have clarity on what that means. So we got to hear a lot of details to know which model they're talking about.
Got it.
And really, I would say what they're talking about in Minneapolis now is not actually dismantling. It's defunding on a radical scale.
Yeah.
So then abolition takes all that, but it has a deeper analysis, or maybe we could think of it more as a long-range vision, which is that, first of all, on the analysis side, it's the understanding that policing and prisons are inherently unjust, that they are tools for reproducing inequality, mostly along lines of class and race, but not, and can include sexuality and gender and other factors as well. But
mental health.
Yes, which
category,
but mental health, like those mental health effects are experienced primarily in our poorest communities, because rich people with mental health problems don't have those kinds of police contacts. Typically, there are obviously exceptions. So, and about the estimates are 50% of people killed by police have some form of disability, a mental health challenge, deafness, hard of hearing, depending on which term you prefer, etc. So that is a staggering figure.
And totally underexplored. Like you never hear about the hard of hearing and deaf people. You hear about mental illness, but I remember reading an article about someone who, and I realized like no one talks about this. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. So there's that analysis that policing and prisons are rooted in class and race oppression, that they're tools for managing regimes of exploitation. And then there's about a vision, right? We want to live in a world that doesn't need to rely on people with guns and cages for human beings to produce social stability. So most abolitionists, I think, in the current moment, they are not entirely clear on exactly what that world looks like, or even exactly how we would get there. It's aspirational, it's a vision. And I think that if we take the trouble to explain it to people, it's a vision that most people would at least agree with philosophically, which is, I don't want to have to live in a world with armed police managing our affairs. But how do we get there, et cetera, becomes more complicated. And that gets us into the realm of much bigger political questions about the, the direction of the country, our political economic systems. And abolitionists, I think part of what's important about that is they're saying there's no technocratic fix to policing and prisons. It's embedded in our fundamental political and economic institutional structures. And so that when people tell us they're going to fix the problem with some implicit bias training in a police community encounter session, it's just laughable, right? Because that completely elides any discussion about the fundamental injustices that those criminal justice institutions are upholding.
It's funny. I remember when I interviewed you last time, I had you on and Craig to talk about the Bronx 120. And I asked you about abolition, and you gave this really great example. You said, well, think of abolition as it already exists. Abolition already exists in schools on the Upper East Side. And you didn't know that I went to Dalton, which I did. Communist summer camp, private high school. And you were like, imagine if you're on the Upper East Side and you get caught with drugs and they say, Katie, go talk to the school psychologist, right? And then if I keep getting caught with drugs again, it's Kate, but we won't tell your parents maybe, right? Then it's Katie, we caught you again. Now we're going to talk to the school psychologist and calling your parents. And if I got caught again, it keeps going up like through different levels, but the police are not involved like ever, right? Like maybe at the end of the day, ultimately I get sent to a clinic or something, or a rehab, some private rehab center. I don't know what it is. But that I remember I was like, oh yeah, I get it. It's so I mean, we can live in a more abolition adjacent society, right? Like right now we could be living in that. It seems like it's more of a spectrum than it sounds, I guess.
Absolutely. When you go to leafy suburbs up in Westchester, there aren't police on every corner harassing people, because they have stability in their lives, because they have economic security and access to resources. And so no one imagines that we need police to manage their affairs, right? Because remember, part of this is a racist project that says that certain suspect classes are incapable of managing their own affairs without the 24-hour-a-day threat of coercive violence.
Right.
And that's kind of the root of so much of this deeply conservative, thin blue line kind of politics that comes out of the police unions and their supporters. It's like, oh my God, if we let up for 1 second, they will rape and shoot everyone.
Right.
And that's racist, right? Because they don't think that for their own communities.
Yes. Right. Of course. Right. And it's interesting. Christian Parenti brought this up, and then I saw them talking about on the Bellows that the relationship between how did he put it's I don't know how to say this because it's very sensitive, and I don't want to sound at all like I'm downplaying racism, but that it's much more of a poverty issue than it's often presented as. It's also a race issue too. And obviously all lives, I'm not at all. I think everyone watching me and listening to me, and you as well, Alex, knows that the slogan of all lives matters is not one that I find compelling at all. And in fact, what that usually means is Black lives don't matter. But how much of an issue, I mean, it's all interconnected, obviously, but how do we tackle this from a perspective that kind of, I don't know, that's actually intersectional, or that presents this as the kind of intersectional issue that it is?
Right. So even if we think that we need to understand this through a class lens or through a political economic lens, right? There is no capitalism. There's no history of capitalism that does not have a race character to it, front and center, right? So sometimes it's less obvious because that racial exploitation has been exported. So we don't see it in a particular domestic context, but it's that that, like in Liverpool, you had white working class exploitation, but Liverpool was also the center of the British slave trade.
Right.
So the wealth and power of Liverpool was a product of that racial exploitation. It was just not in your face in the same way. So African Americans always have this extra burden. We've got a lot of research that shows that, you know, middle class African American neighborhoods are criminalized like poor white neighborhoods
right.
are, right? You know, and that if we're going to make progress on this, I think what's happening now is actually very encouraging, because what you have is, although there need to be some tweaks, obviously, what you have is a racial justice movement with multiracial buy-in, right? Because if you look at the streets, right, this is not just African Americans out on the streets. There's a broader understanding now that American racism interferes with the ability to have any kind of progressive politics. So that the only way we're going to get out of this is to build these cross-race alliances. The trick is we have to both be certain to prioritize the leadership and analysis that comes out of the African American community, while making sure not to lose track of that deeper analysis of class inequality in the United States. And we can kind of look a little bit at the Black Panthers in some interesting ways, because I think there are a lot of misconceptions today about the Black Panthers, that they were somehow just analogous to Malcolm X or something, that they were invested in a kind of Black nationalism, and that really was not true. They were actually opposed to that they had an anti-imperialist analysis, and they had a deep class analysis, and they were willing to work in coalition with primarily white organizations who shared their anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-racist analysis. And so I think that's the situation. We need both non-Black people to become more invested in participating in an anti-racist movement, and we need the whole thing to develop a stronger anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist analysis.
Right.
And that the Black Lives Matter movement has not as clearly articulated that anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist analysis, but it is there in things like solidarity with Palestine.
Yeah.
So that does include that kind of anti-imperialist analysis, but that is sort of muted, especially in the current moment.
Yeah. It's funny. I meant more, I mean, hadn't really formed this question that well, but I was speaking to someone today, and this is probably a different topic, so I'll put another pin in it, but about how to talk about this in ways that are, because it's such an important issue from an organizing perspective, to make it clear that this is an issue that does affect different people differently. But let me think about, I'll return to this when I have it more organized in my head. It's based on an anecdotal conversation I just had with someone who, I'm not in New York City now, so I'm having conversations that I don't have in my daily life in Manhattan. I'm outside of the city during this thing, but let's see, there's some questions for you from here, and then I'll ask, I have some more, but I just want to,
Great.
Broken, I don't know if you can see this. Can you see this? There's comments. Do you see it? If you click on there.
If I put my glasses on, let's see here.
Yeah.
I don't, I can turn on the chat. Are they in the chat?
They are, but I can also just read you.
Why don't you just do that?
So two people have actually asked about broken windows, which we've talked about. Have I talked about? I can't keep track of this show and then the Useful Idiots.
Yeah, I don't know.
Can you talk about what broken windows practice is? And by the way, when do that, please.
Well, you call a glazier and they come and they fix the window and put a new. No.
Yeah.
Okay. So broken windows theory emerges in the early 80s. It appears in the Atlantic magazine, not a peer-reviewed journal, and it's written by two intellectuals associated with the University of Chicago who are, basically neoconservative ideologues.
Are they recovering Jewish Marxists? I can say this as someone who's comes from a long line of not recovered, just Jewish Marxists.
No, I don't think they were.
Okay.
I don't think they were. There were some people in their circle.
Right.
And of course we know there were a lot of neocons who come out of that.
Yeah.
So they're trying to engage in this kind of urban policy retrenchment in the wake of the war on poverty. They're trying to argue that the war on poverty was wasteful and ineffective, and that it created, these chinks in the racial order, essentially, that it liberated communities who don't know how to manage their own liberation. Right, so it's racist at its core.
Right.
And it says, and they were friends with the bell curve people, and Milton Friedman, right, and Edward Banfield, who was a racist. So they're saying that the problems of the inner city are because Black people have been given too much freedom.
Yeah, and too many handouts, right?
Right. Now, this is not their language. I'm ascribing this to them based on an extensive, deep reading of their work and knowing their history. And I write about a fair amount of this in the book. So they're trying to put the genie back in the bottle by using the police to re-regulate the public behavior of certain suspect populations. And interestingly, they were ignored at first. Mm. It was almost 8 or 10 years before it got real traction. And the reason it got traction is because the problem of homelessness and intensive poverty became more problematic in the cities, and this gave rise to this kind of neoconservative backlash politics. So San Francisco, which experienced tremendous homeless problem that was exacerbated by the '89 earthquake, throws out its liberal mayor and brings in its chief of police as mayor on a broken windows, round up the homeless platform. And then in '93, of course, Giuliani takes over in New York on the same kind of platform. Get the squeegee men,
right,
get rid of the homeless encampments, get rid of the bad people. If they don't like it, they should leave New York, this sort of thing. So the point here is that the broken windows theory served a political purpose. And so it was revivified for that purpose. And this is a theme in my work, which is that when we see a problem turned over to the police to manage, we have to ask ourselves, what's the political project that it's being mobilized to serve? So the war on drugs is mobilized by Nixon to try to get historically white Southern Democratic voters into the Republican Party in the wake of the Civil Rights movement, right? So the war on drugs had nothing to do with public health or public safety or even drugs. It was a political tool to use to carry out a political function. And the broken windows theory serves that same function. Yeah. I hope that wasn't too convoluted and long-winded an answer. So feel put a follow-up in the chat, folks, if you had something more you wanted to know about.
It comes from the idea, right? It's a very paternalistic idea, right? And it comes literally from the idea that if you live in a neighborhood where there's unrepaired broken windows, that encourages you, that sends a message that no one cares about broken windows, so you might as well go ahead and break another one. Or a car. Was it a car?
Well, it was a car, right? So the theory was based on a loose analogy that to some social psychology research, that was done that showed that if you parked a car on a street, it would be fine for a long time. But if you parked a car and you broke one window out of it, it would very quickly become filled with trash, vandalized, etc. And they said, therefore, if we allow Black people to walk around and, you know, drink beer in public, or they literally said, or interracial couples walking down the street, that, yeah, they had, that
oh my
this
God,
was
that was in the original
this
piece.
was a sign. This was a sign of disorder that might offend people and cause them to abandon the public spaces and give the whole world over to the predators, who of course are always sitting in wait for the opportunity.
Right. Yeah.
And therefore the solution is the intensive policing of everyday activity of targeted populations. And that's what leads to this massive expansion in misdemeanor arrests.
Right. Yeah, I always thought that was so stupid, because like, even if you thought that was true, then what, to put together a band of like broken window relief, teams or something.
Well, there's this whole thing where even in the follow-up book, Fixing Broken Windows, there's a whole discussion about the New York City subways. And the subways were out of control. There was the graffiti and there was some crime. Right. And they tell this story about, well, how did they get rid of the graffiti? Well, they brought in cleaners and they bought new subway cars. And I'm like, yes, that's what we need to do.
Right.
That has nothing to do with the police. It has nothing to do with the broken windows theory. Just reinvest in the transit system and it'll get better. Right. And so even their own examples don't make any sense.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
They tried criminalization to get rid of graffiti, and it was a complete failure, and people were literally killed. And once we gave up a policing strategy and just invested in new subway cars and more cleaners, the situation got much better.
So what does this look like in terms of the personnel or actual police officers? What's the plan moving forward? What happens to the police? Who fulfills what functions? You talked about attrition. Can you talk more about the
yeah. So for the invest divest movement, the defund thing is kind of, that language is somewhat new. That wasn't the language that I ever used. But for this new movement, people are clear about what they're doing. But there is some conversation about the language. But I think there is a lot of clarity in the movement about what we're talking about. So in that movement, what people are talking about, for the most part, is the idea that we need to identify the specific public safety challenges that people are experiencing in their communities. Is it a domestic violence problem? Is it an opioid overdose problem? Is it a youth violence problem? And then develop targeted specific interventions to address those public safety problems without relying on armed police. So it's going to look like a lot of different things. It might look like cure violence systems that hire people from the community to work with younger kids to break the cycle of violence, to get them involved in trauma counseling and pro-social activities and vocational training, and to try to work out beefs and establish truces between, warring crews from different housing projects or whatever. It looks like hiring more mental health clinicians and creating community-based mental health strategies so that the NYPD doesn't have to go on 200,000 EDP calls every year.
EDP is emotional.
Yeah, that's their term. That's their term, right? So someone having a mental health crisis of some kind. It means getting rid of narcotics units and putting in harm reduction strategies, legalization or decriminalization schemes. It means getting rid of the vice unit and decriminalizing sex work. It means getting rid of homeless outreach police units and actually putting people in supportive housing. So that it's not like one thing. Now, I do think there are some possibilities here for some additional creative thinking. So if you think about the two most recent deaths in Atlanta and Minneapolis, you know, there was no real reason for armed police to be involved in either of those incidents, right? An allegation of a counterfeit $20 bill and someone asleep in their car, you know, blocking a drive-through window of a fast food restaurant. So Minneapolis has this thing that on the weekends downtown, where there are lots of bars and restaurants, it's really fun if you haven't been there. They have these teams of nonprofit outreach workers who can be dispatched to try to help manage people getting in a fight after the bars close or making too much noise or throwing bottles or whatever. And they try to resolve as much of this as they can without any involvement of police.
Mm-hmm.
In the UK, they have these neighborhood wardens who work with local businesses, who try to keep an eye on problems of trash and kids really causing a nuisance in front of a business, let's say. No arrest powers, no use of force powers. They just go and talk to people. Now, these systems are not perfect. They have this some of them have a somewhat punitive character to them, like the UK example, but we could have something that is community-oriented, community-based. They're problem solvers. They have mediation training. They have violence de-escalation training. They live in the community so that they know people, and they're like, Jimmy, why are you doing that? I'm going to tell your grandmother. Go home. Cut that out, right? Nobody gets shot. Nobody gets tasered. Nobody gets arrested. But problems get resolved to some extent. So somebody knocks on the car window and says, wake up, man. Look, you're too drunk to drive. Give me your keys. I'm going to pull the car out of the way and let's get you a cab. Because when the officers asked him to get out of the car, he complied.
Mm-hmm.
It was when they tried to arrest him that he said, well, fuck that. I don't want to get arrested. And then he fought with them, right? And he's drunk. And then and because they're armed police, they're like, well, of course we got to kill you now. Right? So if there'd been no armed police there in the first place, these guys would still be alive. And of course, there's also, why did the store owner call the police?
Yeah.
I tried to spend a bad $10 bill one time. I didn't realize that it was bad. And the guy was just like, oh, this is no good. Do you have a credit card?
Right.
Nobody called the police. And similarly, that fast food guy could have had one of his employees just go knock on the window and be like, yo, wake up, dude. Could you pull your car over here out of the way? So there's that too that we've got to address. Quit weaponizing the police. Right.
Now, what happens to the individual police officers? Where do they go? Because when I had Christian Parenti on, he was concerned about kind of a Blackwater type of phenomenon, and also just a bunch of like disaffected armed dudes.
Yeah, if you look at these movements across the country, the defund or the invest, divest, or reinvestment movements, mostly the targets, the dollar amounts that they're talking about don't involve layoffs. This could be achieved through attrition, through cuts to overtime, through cuts to, you know, buying tanks and tear gas and stuff like that. So this is not about laying off large numbers of police. It's just about not hiring them. And I'll just tell a little story, if I can, about a talk I gave in Houston a little while back, and some police officers came, black and brown police officers came, and we talked for a while afterwards, and they were like, when we were kids, we lived in neighborhoods that the police were real jerks. They were a source of danger for us. They didn't respect us. And we thought, you know, we're trying to figure out what to do with ourselves. And we thought, well, this is a career where maybe we could get in there and kind of change the culture of policing and make the police do something positive for kids in the community. And they're like, but man, it did not work. It failed. We could not change the culture of policing. They were trying to ask me, what should we have done differently? And I'm like, There's no changing the culture of policing. It's built into the institutional mission. But let me ask you guys a question. When you were thinking of joining the police department, if there had been a choice between a job as a cop or a different job with the same pay and benefits, working in a neighborhood community center, coaching football and mentoring kids, which job would you have chosen? Which job would you have chosen? Of course, they laugh and they're like, "Oh man, are you kidding? We would much rather have been coaching kids and working with them." But there were no such jobs. And I'm like,
right.
Exactly. Why are there never those jobs? And it was that point, because they were still trying to figure out what the heck I was talking about. And it was that point that they finally got it. They were like, right, the police department is always hiring and there are never those jobs.
Yeah. It's a really good point. Also, I think like people need to remember that so often people are like, well, it sounds like a good idea on paper, but it'll never work. And like, nothing works until it's done. You know, like people say that about, I'm sure, about Social Security. They said that about, Medicare. They said that like same-sex marriage, they were sure that would never pass.
But we have evidence for most of this stuff.
Right.
I mean, it does work. We actually know it works. I mean, one thing to keep in mind here, right, is that there is no perfect world.
Yeah.
This is another like effort to undermine the movement of these people are all naive and utopian.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
And my thing is like, no, anyone who says we can fix policing with implicit bias is being naive and utopian. Right. I actually understand how this institution works. These are violence workers carrying out a fundamentally unjust mission. Right. That is the realistic, hard-headed assessment of the situation. And the people doing this work are trying to produce safety. That's why they get out of bed every morning. That is what their motivation is. And there is evidence to support these interventions. My book has hundreds of endnotes with reports and studies and examples. And, we can get rid of the drug war. We can get rid of the criminalization of sex work. We could create an actual mental health system. We have examples in the US, we have examples internationally. This is an evidence-based movement.
Yeah. I think that it's interesting. It's like, so you have something like Medicare for all that people are like, that could never happen. But this is a very like seductive, that could never happen argument, I think, because people think of the police as keeping people safe. That's the idea that's been communicated, right? So they think there's going to be, even if people, I think there's some people out there who are like, well, it sounds like a good idea, but how are we going to get there? It's going to be mayhem and bedlam, and what is it?
Yeah, bedlam and mayhem.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, not at all, because the way this, look at Minneapolis initially, right? There was a struggle underway in Minneapolis before George Floyd was killed. They were calling for a $45 million cut to the police budget and then investments in community identified needs to address things like youth violence and untreated mental illness, right? And so this is not about there's some magic switch and poof, there are no police.
Right.
This is about, we build this up, we bring this down, we see what works, this takes place over time, right? No city council in America is going to zero out the police budget this year.
Yeah.
That is not in the cards.
Right.
This is about, we chip away, we show the logic of what we're doing, we show that it works, right? And we build on that. Yeah.
And what do you think of, should Joe Biden's, I was thinking maybe Joe Biden's slogan could be Biden shooting you in the leg, not the heart. Did you hear that, did you hear his idea about having, why don't they teach cops to shoot people in the legs? Which literally is what I asked my parents as a little kid. I remember thinking that.
So that was Joe off the cuff.
Yeah.
Which was pretty terrible.
Yeah.
Then there's Joe after his advisors have spoken to him, which was, we're going to give the police $300 million more dollars.
That's no excuse.
So that they can do policing better. right? And that's worse. That's
exactly.
worse.
We're all used to Uncle Joe, like the gas pro.
Right, but this is actually this is what they're actually going to do. This is what they're actually going to do.
So, and what is how? I mean, what do you think, by the way, of the difference between the Dems and the Republicans on this issue?
And
that's a huge question. One. Yeah, I guess.
Well, I'm waiting to see one.
I mean, yeah, I guess the discourse is different, right? I mean, what's the
right? Well, one has kente cloth and the other doesn't.
I know. I think we should play a game called Name That Party, where you go to the mayor or governor and you figure out which party they are.
Well, at the local level, it's worse in a sense that there's really no difference in many cases. Right. There's a bipartisan consensus of turning every problem over to the police to manage. So at the federal level, I mean, there are some interesting developments. I've been working with Ayanna Pressley's office and have been reviewing bill language with them for the last couple of weeks. And the bill that's out now, the policing bill, it came from the sort of center of the party, and it's pretty terrible. It has a few kind of harm reduction things in it, like around chokeholds and sorry, I'm blanking, but a couple of other things.
Oh yeah, like,
no knock warrants is good. I mean, that's good. That could save some lives, including police lives, frankly. But it's not going to get to the root of the problem. So there is some stuff developing that would look more like what the defund movement is calling for from a federal perspective. This is getting rid of existing federal subsidies. I mean, the Trump administration just recently announced another $400 million for the cops office to give local places more money to hire police. The cops office is running Operation Relentless Pursuit, which wants to flood 7 cities with federal agents and money for more local police. I'm part of a national organizing effort in those cities to say to those mostly Democratic mayors, why are you advancing Trump's core political process here by embracing his we're going to get the gangbangers and the drug cartels, right? You're assisting the Republican playbook by going along with this.
Right.
So this bill would get rid of all that, and it would incentivize cities to cut their police budgets by offering them money for these community-based interventions if they hit certain funding cut thresholds.
Right.
So it's the reversing of the 94 crime bill.
Got it. 49 crime bill. Just kidding. I remember talking about this with you briefly, and you were saying how, relatively insignificant it is to punish individual police officers in terms of where our priorities should be, like how our priorities should be on actually, abolition, defunding, dismantling, one of those, right? But does it not, like, recognizing that that's not a sufficient goal, does it not prevent some violence and maybe some murder in the very immediate sense when you have a culture that, not even culture, when you have a precedent of police officers being punished for murder or for abuse or violence?
Yeah. So again, I think I mentioned Derica Purnell wrote a great column for The Guardian about this. Yeah. So people should Google her and jail killer cops and take a look at that to go more deeply into it. And I discuss it in my book as well in chapter 1. But so I'm not against firing officers. Let's fire as many as we can, frankly. But I do have concerns about this idea that A, this is going to fix policing,
right,
and B, that we want to rely on the carceral system to fix our problems.
Yeah.
That system is not designed to solve our problems, and that's why it never does. And we're just re-legitimating that system and our reliance on punitiveness and revenge as a strategy for changing behavior and achieving justice.
Right.
So Mariam Kaba also has written about what a dead-end strategy this is ultimately.
Right.
So I'm perfectly fine with firing officers. I mean, I think we should set a very low threshold for firing officers. You know, but I don't. But even that, it's not. We don't have evidence. We don't have a lot of reason to think that that's going to make policing better.
Yeah.
You know, everyone was so excited when that cop was jailed for murder in Chicago for killing Laquan McDonald. Right. Everyone, oh my goodness, this is the best thing ever. But you know, I was in Chicago earlier this year. Nobody is dancing in the streets on the south side of Chicago about how great the police are now.
Yeah.
Right. Nothing has changed.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Feel free to stay. I'm sure you are so busy, and I'm so grateful that you gave us this time. We're about to chat with two candidates for office. You feel free to join. Feel free to take some questions. It's totally up to you. Just very excited.
Well, I'll stick around for a little bit. I'm feeling okay.
Awesome.
The scotch is kicking in, so it's nice and mellow over here.
Awesome. No, it's good. This is great. I love this. This is so cool. Okay. I should have given you guys a warning, but you guys, how exciting is this? And by the way, I just want people to know, if you're just joining me, this is a very atypical lineup. I have more women in the mix, so I just don't want people to think that I'm not centering my women, my sisters, and a guest. But I'm very excited to have this combo of guests, and I don't know if you all know each other, but
Professor Vitale, you taught when I was at Brooklyn College. I just never took classes.
Great.
Yes.
Yeah, love your work. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, so
thank you.
I didn't get a chance to take one of your classes when I went there for undergrad, but I know of you.
Well, there you go.
Very good.
Now you get like a tutorial. You get a very.
I know. I see his books behind him, so I literally before this started, I ran to grab some of my policing books off the shelf.
Oh, nice.
So I wasn't, left off.
I don't see it.
I have mine right here.
Wow.
Very good.
Yeah.
Very good. I've got a YouTube channel where I've been interviewing authors ever since COVID-19. And so a bunch of these are the books that I've done interviews with. So you can find those on YouTube.
Awesome.
So I like this combination because we have the academic intellectual corner, and then we have, not that you guys aren't academic and intellectual also, but the roads you're pursuing. You guys are doing the office, running for office. And Alex is doing the writing for students, teaching for students, writing for people, and I'm doing the live streaming for everyone. So Isaiah and Peter, welcome, and please tell us why. We'll start with you, Isaiah, and then you, Peter. Why you guys are running for office? What inspired you?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Katie, for having me on. I know Peter personally, so. Me and Pete talk often, we're actual friends. We know each other. So for those who don't know me, my name is Isaiah James. I'll get to the real down and dirty. I'm running for office because, the problems that we face obviously cannot wait to be addressed anymore. We've had the same old corporate spiel from corporate Democrats and from money-hungry Republicans for the last 70, 80 years. And whatever we have done to lead us to this point is not working. And the moment demands so much more. This is more than just platitudes. This is more than just pat on the back and giving, fancy colloquialisms. This is the time for action. And when over a year ago, when I met with my member of Congress around some real salient issues around criminal justice reform and housing and education, she was almost insulted that I would bring these things up. And that night I made it my mission. I was like, you know what? If I want to see the change, I have to be the change. I came home that night and I told my wife about it. I was racking my brain, and literally at 2 a.m, I Googled how to run for Congress.
Really?
I swear to you.
Was your wife like, I wish we had a power outage that night?
And this is somebody with a political science background for undergrad and a public policy background for graduate school. And I still had no idea.
Wow.
I Googled how to run for Congress, watched a few YouTube videos, and a year later, here I am.
Wow. Awesome. Well, Pete, that's a hard act to follow.
Oh, always. I try to go before Isaiah.
Yeah, sorry, I set you up.
Yeah, I was just thinking, Isaiah, the last time we actually hung out in person was outside Chuck Schumer's house. We were protesting
that was December.
Wow.
Back in the good days,
Yeah.
when it was just protesting potential war with Iran.
Oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, Katie, thank you so much for having me on. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Peter Harrison, and I am a housing activist, democratic socialist, and a professor at Baruch College, where Isaiah got his master's degree. And I am running in New York 12, which is the east side of Manhattan, Western Queens, and North Brooklyn. I have been a housing activist on the ground in the city for over 10 years with the DSA, with Housing Justice for All. And we've done an immense amount of good more recently, just last year up in Albany. But a lot of the work that I've done at the policy side has been at the federal level. And there's only so much that we can get done for housing justice at the local level. And I think when I started running in this race, people would say, oh, Pete, you're a housing person. That's great. You should run for something local. Housing is not a national issue. And I certainly think with everything with COVID happening, that's not, I'm not hearing that anymore.
Right.
But certainly with everything that's been happening in the last couple of weeks as well, I try to use housing as a lens to talk about economic inequality and racial injustice and climate disaster. And when we talk about what we need to do right now, and Alex has obviously written an immense amount of work on this, from my perspective, you've really got to tackle the logic of the incentives of the capitalist system that the police are really just the tip of the spear on. And to me, that's always been about taking on the real estate industry. It's an immensely powerful, very underrated villain in our political system. I'm very proud to have worked on the Holmes Guarantee, which is a national progressive plan to really not just make housing a right in the abstract, as Isaiah said, sort of platitudes, but to actually make a plan that says, we're going to put people over property. And we live in a world that does the opposite of that right now. So that's really been the core of my race, going back to the beginning of the race, going against Representative Maloney. And don't get me wrong, I really wish these circumstances were not happening, that people weren't struggling so much to pay rent. People weren't recognizing the limitations of what the federal government can do. But because we are in this moment, because people are out in the streets protesting, it is a time to make structural change. And we really have to do that at the federal level. And we have to do that through our homes. Yeah,
it's interesting you brought that up. Well, I had Samelis Lopez on, who's another person who really comes at it from a housing perspective, and good friend of the show / someone I've known since I was 5 years old, Ava Farkas, who's the executive director of Met Council on Housing. Another person who's really, obviously looks at the world and works in the world through the lens of housing. But when you said that, you reminded me of Eric Garner. One of the things I learned from reading my co-host Matt Taibbi's book before we co-hosted Useful Idiots, I read his book I Can't Breathe about Eric Garner, and I didn't realize until reading that how the police were harassing him in large part because they were trying to quote unquote clean up the neighborhood for real estate, the real estate industry. And so this is really, I think that COVID has really demonstrated all these things that we've been saying about how interconnected all of these issues are. I wanted to know, Alex, and then I'm going to go back to the candidates. But Alex, what you see as the connection between housing and criminal justice, or what you think that people need to know about those issues that isn't really underlined, except for people like our other fine guests, but in general.
Well, that's actually how I got into this business.
Oh, right. Yeah. Right.
Was Kristen, that I was working at the San Francisco Coalition on Homelessness. Yes, and Christian Parenti and I were roommates at that time.
That's why I keep bringing him up. I think it's so cute. I'm waiting for one of you to spill some inside gossip.
And I was working on housing policy for the Homeless Coalition, and I had studied economic development and community development stuff in college, and but it was around 1990 that we started to see this huge uptick in the criminalization of homeless folks. And I was asked to look into it and started thinking about it more. And it was clear that what happened is that the city of San Francisco had given up on the possibility that they were going to actually house people and just turn the problem over to the police to manage. So they used the cops to drive people out of public spaces, break up encampments, get rid of panhandlers in front of businesses, and that their ability to manage that problem through punitive policing allowed them to continue to ignore the housing crisis, essentially, especially for those at the very lowest end of the economy. And I would just say, in addition, right, that homelessness is about a mismatch between income and housing. And we had deterioration on both of those. Housing prices kept going up and incomes kept going down at the bottom of the economy. And this was in part the result of these kind of global city economic development strategies, which involve subsidizing the already most successful parts of the economy in hopes that it would somehow magically trickle down to the rest of us. But instead, it just distorted housing and labor markets. And this is the subject of City of Disorder, my previous book. And so, yeah, policing allows for these distorted housing markets. It allows for mass homelessness.
Yeah, and I think that's why in New York City, and Isaiah's been around this, Mayor de Blasio and Governor Cuomo are so afraid of pissing off the cops, but they're really afraid of pissing off the real estate industry, because that's really what runs the show here. And that direct line connection really is this kind of secret villain that we're just sort of starting to put these dots together on.
Well, I think, and I want to take it a step further, Peter and Alex. I mean, I think we need to connect all of these things because, say we're talking about, policing and the real estate industry. So there might be those out there who have secure housing and really don't have to worry about police officers dealing with them because they might be of a certain color or persuasion. So we need to seriously connect all these things of how, unjust housing is a product of over-policing, which is a product of the military-industrial complex funneling them weapons, which is a product of all these giant corporations buying politicians, and how all of this stuff literally is interconnected by the thread of corporate money in our politics. If we remove that one thread of corporate money in our politics, and now it's no easy task to sever that thread because it's the golden thread that props up all these corporate politicians. But if we were to remove that, then elected officials would actually be elected officials and not politicians, and they would be beholden to the people who put them in office. For example, in my race, my opponent, Yvette Clarke, has one of the most liberal voting records, but she sits on some very powerful committees, the Energy and Commerce Committee. She takes hundreds of thousands from natural gas and real estate. That's why we can't get the Green New Deal moved. She takes money from big pharmaceuticals and big, insurance companies. That's why Medicare for All single payer is dead on arrival. She takes money from real estate folks. That's why any AMI or any bill to deal with housing is dead on arrival. So just because folks have a D or R next to their name, that's not the problem. The problem is removing all this corporate money so we can actually start to deal with the root of the problem.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Isaiah, is there an issue do you have not a pet issue that sounds so dismissive, but is there one issue in particular that really for Pete, it's a housing thing, not to reduce you to that either, but do you have a particular issue that, really drives you? That's like the thing that
this might sound cliche, Katie, but it's all of them. So I'll give you it. So what about the trans kid of color who has a place to live, but is worried about student loans and thinking about committing suicide because they can't even come out and be themselves? Or what about the person who is a disabled veteran who can't access resources? We can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Right.
I think that we shouldn't compartmentalize our issues.
Yeah.
That's where we lose sight, because then everybody gets pigeonholed and it's fighting for one thing. If we stand together in a collective voice and say, listen, all of this bullshit is wrong and we need to fix all of it. That way we get everybody on the boat, because guess what? If I'm out here marching for Black lives, if I'm not a Black person, it really might not matter to me. But there might be an issue that this person cares about. The white suburbanite might really care about the opioid addiction and how, pharmaceutical companies are flooding their neighborhood. So we can get them along our side too, and we can all march together. Because everybody sees Martin Luther King Jr. like it was for civil rights. It was for jobs. It was for
anti-imperialism. Yeah,
exactly. It was against the imperialism in Vietnam. So I don't have one specific issue, because there's, if your house is on fire and the other person's house just got wrecked by a tornado, how do we decide which one is more important?
Well, it's interesting what you just said, because I actually thought the Black Lives Matter rally and then a white opioid issue. I actually think that what's so like necessary is for people to not see these as this as a zero-sum game. And so you don't just go to the rally for opioid overdoses for white people in, I don't know, in like upstate New York, or like you were saying, pigeonholed. I do think like one of the downsides of compartmentalizing all of this is that it just, such an obvious effective divide and conquer tool, right? And if people see that, like, if people get, the whole point is we want everyone going out for all of the rallies. I know that sounds stupid, but like, the movement to be for all of these things, as opposed to just because these things are so interconnected.
They really truly are.
Yeah, and the Dems are the corporate Dems are so good at turning them into niche markets.
Listen, Martin Luther King Jr. said, we may have come here on different ships.
Yeah.
But we're all in the same boat now.
Yeah.
And we don't have a choice, because guess what? Climate change doesn't give a damn your social economic status, your religious background is coming, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
So,
you may have some more time to tackle,
but
you
can get to the top of the mountain before I can, but still still rising.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly. You'll get drowned.
Again,
have some more time. Yeah, right.
It's because of everything with COVID as this, and I don't want to call it a dress rehearsal for climate disaster, because it's a disaster in its own right. But, clearly, and Isaiah's been there as well, part of the reason that we're running against these sort of corporate Democratic in the party, it's how inadequate the response has been to COVID, how inadequate, like, our institutions are not prepared for something like this. Every other Western country has healthcare as a right, was able to kind of shut down the economy and protect workers. These are not really difficult policies to put in. Most countries did this, and ours basically fell apart. And clearly we've sort of given up any kind of policies to try to shut down COVID at this point. So it's, I'm glad that you mentioned this, Isaiah, about climate disaster, because it really is, unfortunately, a dress rehearsal. And by all measures, we're coming up wanting here, because we've got, one party who basically is completely bad faith against any sort of institutional support or like governing competence. And then we have the Democratic Party that they're managers, really. And it's almost like they're police that are sort of managing this stuff as opposed to fixing this stuff. And we are running out of time to do this. And if COVID is not a wake-up call, and if the George Floyd protests that have meant in this uprising is not a wake-up call, like, I'm very optimistic. I think, Isaiah, we were actually talking about this, I think, last week about like, what's the turnout going to be like during COVID? But I think with everybody, voting with their feet kind of right now, I think there is this appreciation that we do need action outside of the electoral politics, but we do need good people inside electoral politics. So I think there's a lot of reason to be at least some silver lining in all of this, is that it's clearly broken. The people in there right now are not going to fix it. And we actually have an opportunity in 10 days to start making some changes.
Right. Alex, I just wanted to give you a chance to, because you've been on.
I have a question.
Oh, yeah.
I have a question, actually, because I've been thinking about something, and I'm wondering, because, it's clear that what's happening now on the streets is not just about policing, right? Just like when we look back at the 1960s and the uprisings and the riot, while those were usually triggered by policing, they weren't just about policing, right? It was about a racial justice movement and deep inequality. And I wonder if the demonstrations are larger and more multiracial, ironically, because Sanders is out of the race. Because
I don't think it's because Sanders is out of the race. I think.
Well, let me just say one more thing about this. Why I think this could be a factor, which is just that the people don't see a way for their views to be acted on, because the leadership of both parties is completely unwilling to take seriously anything they're saying. And so they feel they have no choice but to express it out on the streets. While when Sanders was in the race, at least there was the possibility of an electoral strategy for them.
I see what you're saying. I see.
Yeah. So it's not blaming Bernie. It's blaming the Democratic Party, really.
I like your instincts, Isaiah, though. I'm the same. I'm like, wait, what are you saying about Amo Bernie?
No, my take on it is that, like I said before, the moment demands so much more. And just how Republicans, their base is getting older and dying off and whiter. Corporate Democrats and do-nothing Democrats, this is the last vestige of this running, uber moderate like Joe Biden, who says no Medicare for all. He doesn't want to defund the police. Like I said, the thing about knowledge and the thing about learning is once somebody gets it, once somebody's eyes are open, you can't take it away and you can't close those eyes. So these young 17 and 18-year-olds who are out marching right now, they're going to be thinking this for the next 30, 40 years, because either we're going to fix it in the government or they're going to be more and more radicalized because they can see their government is not meeting the needs. And like Pete said, out of the 33 industrialized countries in the world, 32 provide healthcare. 32 have a strong social safety net. The only one that doesn't is this one we're sitting in right now. That's why South Korea was able to shut down, and Canada and all these other places, because their social safety net was such that they could take care of the people. America just told us, here's $1,200, fix it yourself. And we're in the middle of a global pandemic of 2 million infected people in this country. Yet again, the defense budget is more and more and more. Yet again, the budget for the NYPD is $6 billion. Yet again, in New York State, we're cutting $400 million from hospitals. They're talking about laying off teachers. But there's always enough money for bombs and bullets, but never enough for books and backpacks. I refuse to believe that. I reject that notion. We have the money. We just need the political courage. We need people like Pete and myself and others out there who are running right now, not taking a dime of that corporate money, who have integrity, who will stand up and actually do this thing for the people, because we are the people. Before I got into this, I was struggling to pay my rent. I have student loans. You know what I mean? I have a wife who's a teacher with a pre-existing condition. I'm not some, well-groomed, pedigreed, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford. I went to Brooklyn College. I went to Baruch. I'm just a normal, everyday person who stood up to say,
CUNY.
Exactly.
Yeah. My mom went to City College and then LaGuardia.
And that's what our corporate opponents don't understand, is that this is not the end. This is literally the beginning. And they better buckle up. There's a war coming.
There's a war coming. Your signal. Can you say that again? Because your thing clipped out right then. I think
they better buckle up, because this is the whirlwind coming. This is not the end. This is absolutely the beginning. Because unless they fix, I don't see any metric that they're going to fix anything. Things are only going to get worse. They're only going to get more exacerbated. And we haven't even begun to feel the effects of the coronavirus. That's going to come 2 years from now. And that's when we're really going to start to see the effects. And then it's going to be all hell breaking loose, honestly.
I know. I mean, it's so brutal that, back to your point, Alex, and I obviously, Isaiah, totally agree. It's brutal because Bernie has been this voice of clarity in this moment for so long. And, I was so excited about supporting him in 2016. I've been a huge fan of his going back when I was in grad school for urban planning, like studying community land trust up in Burlington when he was mayor in the 80s. He has shifted the ground so much, and yet the sort of awful irony of him dropping out during all of this is he's been utterly validated, right?
Yeah.
And I think it was such an indictment on the establishment that everything he has said, and had he been in office in 2016, we would have had a social safety net, at least on its way, that would have better managed something like this. Because again, like to Isaiah's point, like this, it's failing, right? Like, and there are enough people that are doing okay that it was sort of enough for the political establishment to kind of ignore it or to manage it, and like let the police kind of get these problems off the streets and away from people and tourists and real estate money. But COVID has, obviously blown that off, and we are still facing COVID. We're going to be doing this for a very long time. But yeah, it does come back to like, we do not have the infrastructure in place to protect ourselves from climate disaster, and the fact that we keep having these massive problems. I mean, again, just in the last 20 years, we've had how many crashes and bailouts, and the idea that somehow capitalism is going to fix these problems when they're obviously generating these problems. It just validated Bernie so much. And obviously it's like, I got to work on his housing plan. It was like a full circle for me. Like I'm running largely because of that, but it's so brutal that the right candidate actually was in the moment. And it was like everything fell apart because
a few months different.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Naomi Klein wrote that piece saying a few months different, he would have won it. And then Keeanga Yamada Taylor wrote that piece about how reality proved Bernie right. And I think the reason he dropped out was because he knew that they were going to keep pushing the, I think he dropped out because of he knew that Biden was going to keep pushing people to get out and vote in under unsafe conditions. That to me, when I saw like Biden, Simone Sanders, no relation obviously to Bernie Sanders, but tell people it was safe to vote because the CDC had said that the day after, I couldn't believe this. Like that was one of those moments where I was like, wow, wait, I really thought Democrats were like better than Republicans on this issue.
No, listen.
I know, I felt so naive.
All your viewers out there, go to opensecrets.org. It is
I know. The
same companies will literally donate 1.5 to Democrats, 1.7 to Republicans.
Right.
They don't care who's in office. All they care is they have access to whoever's in office.
I just didn't think they would actually say the CDC has said it's safe for folks to vote now. And when I wrote a piece about this, and I wanted to be really careful because the CDC had made the announcement on Sunday, and I wanted to make sure it was very conceivable that Simone Sanders didn't know that when she said so just to catch everyone up, Simone Sanders said during the last debate with Bernie and Joe Biden, that the CDC had said it was safe to vote in the primaries. And I didn't know. And because Brianna Joy Gray, who worked for Sanders, tweeted out a clip of this. And the clip just started with her saying that. And I was trying to find out what time the CDC had announced that gatherings of 50 plus people were not safe. And then I found the original clip. And not only had they already said it, but Chris Cuomo said in his question to her, so the CDC says it's unsafe for gatherings of 50 more people. This means like every basically voting location out there. And she says, yeah, the CDC has said it's safe. So I don't know what Senator Sanders is talking about. And anyway, that blew my mind. I just couldn't believe it. Like I knew they're all paid by the same corporations and the corporate interests, but I really thought that maybe the Dems wouldn't like encourage people to go out and vote. But that was naive.
I had this conversation with my wife today. And I was talking to her. I was like, I think I'm just a different type of person. And she's like, what do you mean? And I was like, I don't think a lot of people have integrity. And for me, where I come from, integrity literally meant life or death. You know, I have a military background. If I go to sleep and my buddy says, hey, I'm going to pull guard, I have to trust him with my literal life. And he has to do the same for me. He has to watch my back and my life, my future. Everything is in his hands and vice versa. So when I tell somebody I'm not going to vote for this or take that type of money or do any of that type of things, I truly, truly mean that stuff. Like I would literally die for my word. That's and most people who run for office don't have that. There are a few Pete and other people who I know who I actually like and trust. But the thing that most of these, and I didn't learn this until I started running for office, because I'll tell you a quick story. When I first started running for office, I hired a fundraising guy. He said, what type of money won't you take? And I laid out all the type of money I won't take. He's like, you're going to make this extremely hard for yourself. He told me there were some casino guys trying to open up a casino in Manhattan, and they would be willing to, donate if I was to, back it, or there would be some charter school folks. I'm like, no, I don't do that type of stuff. And he's like, all right, but you're going to make this extremely hard for yourself. And just the fact that he was so callous about it, like, I can get you the money if you want to take it. And just open my eyes to, what am I stepping into?
Mm-hmm.
Are these people, do people really sell out their entire communities like that and just don't care? Like, I could never do that.
And the other really crappy thing about this, and like this has been an education for me too, and Isaiah, we've talked about this, like it's also, and obviously Katie, you're a wonderful exception here having us on here, but there's the media can look at sort of some social media follower stuff, they can look at money, and if you don't have a certain threshold of money, like you don't get covered. And outside of some independent media, outside of just some sort of organic growth, like I think people have, like I worked on AOC's campaign, and I think some people on the left took the wrong lessons from that, of saying like, oh, you can just like build up an army of people to help and small donors. And obviously Bernie Sanders showed some of that. But like what really set AOC apart was getting the massive amount of media coverage. There was just so much excitement around her candidacy. Same thing with Tiffany Caban's campaign a year later. That's really hard as a scalable tactic for the left to do that. There are many great races, many great candidates like Isaiah and me out there. And like the media landscape, it's easier to kind of ignore or shape those narratives because we're not taking money and you're not really taken seriously as a challenger by this sort of establishment unless you do take a lot of money. And like, there just aren't that many avenues for people like us that don't want to take a certain amount of money. And it's a very vicious cycle. And it's,
I mean, but what does that say?
Education.
What does that say when candidates are like, well, I've raised more money than you. So are you equating money to
votes?
Yeah. So you're saying you can buy more votes than me from the people. Those candidates on our side are part of the problem. If you're choosing the lesser of two evils, all you're doing is emboldening lesser evils. The next person is just going to say, all right, I'll be the lesser of two evils. We need to break that cycle. Case in point, one of my challengers, I'll name him by name, Adam Buckadeck, was like, I've raised more money than you. You're a failed candidate. I'm like, dude, that one sentence is a summation of the problem with our politics.
What's his name? Let's get a photo. Adam, what is it?
Buckadeck, the guy who's running, he just got endorsed by the Times. The same people who
how do you spell his last name?
I don't know how the hell it's Bunkkeddkl, something like that. His first name is Adem, Adam. So he's running in the race as well.
Sounds like Parchamenko. I got excited. I thought it was that Hillary guy.
He's taking money from PBA lobbyists, from Oscar Insurance, from charter school folks, literally from the Langone family, the same people who started Home Depot. First of all, what do those Republicans and those big money people see in your campaign that they would donate to you, number one? And number two, if all you think about is money equals votes, then you are part of the problem. And you don't understand that you're feeding into a system that's going to kill democracy altogether. You shouldn't have to raise $50,000. And I wouldn't care if there was 500 people running in my race. Democracy cannot exist in a vacuum. If you go back to the Greek city-state, it literally means demos, the people. You're supposed to take your message to the people and get them to vote for you. You're not supposed to have to raise $400,000 or $500,000 to run in a race. That is the wrong answer. And candidates who think like that are part of the problem, in my opinion.
And you want to tell us, any of you guys about, either of you too, although I'd love to hear about your neighborhood too, Alex, but about the districts you are running to represent.
Let me just jump in for a second here. I think I'm fading out, and I got an early morning tomorrow. So it was really good to hear from you guys, Isaiah and Peter and Katie. Always so much fun chatting, and let's chat again soon.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, great talking.
Good night, guys, and good luck. And let's keep this DSA thing running like mad.
And next time, let's talk sex work decrim.
Yeah, and let's bring some folks on who are working in that area. Okay, very good. Okay, all right. Good night, everybody.
Bye. Good night. All right. Let's see. What we got a couple options here. Hold on. Let's see. Like that? No. I'm not going to center myself. I can center you. No. That's good, right?
That's good. There you go.
Okay, yeah. Tell us about where you guys are, the neighborhoods you're representing.
So I'll go first. So my neighborhood has been the epicenter of a lot of stuff. First of all, Central Brooklyn is the epicenter of gentrification. We're the epicenter of the COVID outbreak in Brooklyn, literally this district. And we are the epicenter of the protests that started at the Barclays Center. Central Brooklyn is on the map. So my neighborhood includes Park Slope, Crown Heights, parts of Brownsville, Sheepshead Bay, Midwood, Flatbush, East Flatbush, literally right in the center of Brooklyn. The community is a working class community, 50.5% African American, a lot of folks from the Caribbean and South America and Haiti and Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, just a working class community. And for the last 14 years, we've been represented by, a damn Fortune 500 billboard who's just collecting a paycheck from Congress and not doing anything, because by every measurable metric, we're doing worse, not better. And she served under Democrats and Republicans, and we've still done worse. So, like I said, I'm running to represent the people in this community who are just like me, like you, like Pete, just everyday people, not rich, not fancy, people who just get up, go to work, want a better life for their children than they had, and want a safe neighborhood to live in.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to see the problem in our political system, you got to look at these gerrymandered districts, congressional districts in New York. They're pretty insane. New York 12 is certainly right up there. It's the east side of Manhattan from 96th Street all the way down to the Lower East Side, North Brooklyn, all of Greenpoint, most of Williamsburg and Bushwick. And then in Queens, it's Long Island City and most of Astoria. The knock on New York 12 has always been it's one of the wealthiest districts in the country, which is true, but it's also one of the most unequal districts. I think it's second or third in terms of economic inequality. It's hard to find a district in New York City that has a majority white population, and they carved this district around for the current incumbent, Representative Maloney, who's been in office since '92. She's one of the wealthiest members of Congress. She's a landlord and real estate investor. But New York 12, regardless of sort of the stats about income, it's 72% home renters. It's one of the largest concentrations of renters in the country. And again, right now we've got somebody on the real estate side of things that are representing us. So this is certainly a district that has an immense amount of gap between the everyday problems of folks struggling to pay their rent, struggling to afford childcare, struggling to afford equal paying jobs, and then the representation that we have from Representative Maloney. And I always say this again, I'm a housing organizer. I've been doing this stuff in this neighborhood for 10 years. Any door that we knock on in New York 12, whether it's where I live in Stuyvesant Town in the East Village, whether it's Queensbridge, the largest NYCHA development in the country, or the largest public housing development in the country, whether it's duplexes in Greenpoint, whether it's even high rises in the Upper East Side, people are struggling here. And I have a saying that I think really kind of nails like the reality here is that if you only make money when you're awake, you are working class. And there are a lot of people in New York 12 that maybe have a good salary, maybe have a fancy job, by some measures are doing pretty well. But then you look at the rent, you look at the cost of transportation, you look at childcare costs, student loans, healthcare costs, chips away, that people that I don't think necessarily would consider themselves to be working class, in fact, are. And that's a big lift of our campaign, is trying to expand that pool of folks that are saying, you've got more in common with the people in the streets right now protesting this, and you've got at the boardrooms that are, funding our representative right now. And we've had some success with that. It's difficult. Again, we don't necessarily have the resources as some of the other folks in the campaign, but that message is true. That message is because I've been living here for 14 years, organizing around this district for 10 years. It's easy to have these conversations about some really big structural changes, because even again, if you're not necessarily housing insecure, as I said earlier, like you're feeling the pinch and you're looking 5 years out and you're saying, how do I get ahead? Like my grandfather, who I'm named after, was an Irish immigrant, moved to Bay Ridge in Brooklyn, was a motorman on the New York City subways, and had a very solid, like, working class life, bought a house, raised my mom and 4 other kids. That's like off the possibilities for most people. And I think putting those things together to say New York used to be a good place to be poor, a good place to be working class with all the public resources. And that has been co-opted and privatized and gentrified. So it's a bigger message that we've been able to kind of get out to some of these communities. And
we're not the liberal bastion that the rest of the country thinks. They see from the outside, they're like, oh, those New Yorkers, everybody's all. I was like, no, there's a lot of dirty politics in New York City, in New York State. There are a lot of people who do not see. Case in point, the absentee ballot. I don't know. You had to fill out an application to get the application, to fill out this damn 16-page story to send in to get mailed your ballot. Now, after they tried to take Bernie Sanders off the ballot.
Oh my God.
When the governor could have just said, you know what, every registered voter, mail them a ballot. That's all he would have had to do. It would have literally taken 30 seconds. Every registered voter gets mailed a ballot. But they make it increasingly hard to try to stymie progressive challengers and folks who dissent from, the machine politics in New York. New York is not what people think it is. In our country as a whole, if you look at it in a microcosm, you might not think, but if you take a 30,000-foot view, because, when I was in the military, I've lived in other countries. I was stationed in Europe for 4 years, and they're so safety net. They get money to go to school. They get free school. They get free health care. Every house has a solar panel. In Germany, they shut down 7 of their 9 nuclear reactors and have gone to green energy. I'm like, you remember back when Obama had the cap and trade stuff for the carbon emissions? America used to have to buy Germany's, credits. Because Germany had so little pollution, America would buy Germany's pollution credits to use to be able to pollute more. So if other European countries can get this done, it's not that hard for us to get this done. And we're all of us, you, me, Pete, we're all screaming the same thing. It's just those who are in power aren't listening. So it's time for the people who are screaming to get into power so we can do what we've actually been screaming about.
Yeah.
I've often said, as a democratic socialist and having worked in a lot of these DSA campaigns, for my campaign, it's not about radicalizing people. It's about normalizing our positions because they are reasonable. It is infinitely reasonable to have healthcare and have education and childcare costs and secure housing. These are entirely reasonable things. Many places in the world have them. We can easily afford to do that here. And we don't because it is a political choice and it's people making money off this stuff. Like it's a lift because there is a conditioned mentality of sort of capitalism and consumer and what's possible. But again, COVID, all the protests we've had, the uprising that we're a part of right now, there is that energy now to say like, yeah, actually, we can't keep like muddling along. We can't just keep re-electing the same kind of middle managers here. Like these are not crazy ideas. These are not hard to do. They just take some political courage. And yeah, we got to go out and sell it to more of these people that maybe don't think of themselves as aligned, but they are. And that's a lot of work, but that's really crappy. We were talking about this, Isaiah, we were going to out hustle everybody. We're going to knock on more doors, stand in front of more subways, go to more tenant meetings. And with COVID, we really couldn't do that. And I think a lot of the grassroots campaigns that really do have this core message, that really are very validated by this stuff, have been struggling to try to get that message out there.
But Pete, this shows that we were right. What's happening right now shows that, okay, so we weren't the kooks talking about this crazy off-brand message. We were actually right. So no matter what happens in this election, this is not the end.
But yeah, so how do you, it's so frustrating because as you said, okay, this proved that so many people were right. And now because of various things, the people who are right, haven't been rewarded and maybe they will, but maybe they won't be. So what's the next step? We can't just give up and cede ground on this. How do we rub it in their faces that they fucked up without seeming like sadists, really? Because that's what I'm struggling with. I'm like,
The only thing I've ever quit in my life was smoking. So I don't quit anything. That's number one. Number two, once this COVID thing gets under control and people can actually come out on the streets, you start organizing again. You start building those movements because we can't allow what has coalesced right now to turn disparate and go back to their corners. People have to stay almost angry. They have to stay engaged because NWA made a song called The Police back in the 80s. People were getting bit by dogs and had water hoses on them back in the 50s and 60s. So that's what happens. And then the civil rights movement came and people were like, oh, well, we have stuff now. We went away. The Rodney King thing happened. They burned down LA. The cops were fired. Oh, you got $1 million? We went away. Now we see George Floyd. We can't allow this to separate and go away because if it does, it's going to keep happening again. We have to keep pushing for the ending the police and defunding the police. We have to keep pushing for universal single-payer health care. We have to keep pushing to end this military-industrial complex because if we don't, look what happened to Occupy Wall Street. They literally occupied Wall Street, but they dissipated and Wall Street got richer and richer and richer, and nothing happened. Nothing happened because they allowed themselves to fade away. We can't allow that. So as an organizer, Pete as an organizer, Katie, you as a media organizer, we have to keep pushing that message because George Floyd isn't the last innocent black man who's going to be killed. It just happened again in Atlanta, somebody running away. It's going to happen. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the kid that died today because they couldn't afford cancer treatments isn't the last one. The person getting evicted in Crown Heights isn't the last one. So these things aren't going to go away unless we actually get people motivated and change the system that we live in.
Yeah.
Yeah. I having gone through now 3 different rent law fights in New York City, in New York State over the last 10 years, 90% of all of that time was us losing to the real estate industry. And we did have a massive victory last year up in Albany. I got arrested with Jumaane Williams and a bunch of people outside Cuomo's office. It was fun. It's slow and it's brutal. And I think there are people that recognize the hard work. They go to those long meetings. They go to the actions, they go to the local community boards, they do that work. And then not everybody has to do that. Some people just need to come and vote or need to take part in whatever. So I think recognizing that there are different roles to play in this is a part of it as well. And how do you channel that enthusiasm? Alex was saying earlier, with Bernie out of the race was that energy kind of put out on the streets because of all the protests and the uprising. Clearly, there's a lot of people that want the kind of change that we're all talking about. Some of us are going to get through in 10 days and win. And that's going to be a couple more people along the line here to get some more stuff done. But it's not one campaign or candidate. It's not one cycle.
Right.
And that's hard because you get excited, you get fired up. And I was at Occupy Wall Street and, getting run around by cops and all that stuff. And then it was very disappointing that we weren't able to sort of leverage that into an electoral strategy, but it's manifested in different ways and it's bubbled back up.
Yeah.
So it's a stop and start process. And I think that's the managing the expectations that we need to have. And Bernie was always so good at that that dude's been doing this thing for 40 years. And I'm sure Isaiah,
40 years or 40?
40
years.
Okay. Yeah.
It's brutal. It just,
I know he lost his first 3 races, right? He lost a bunch of times before he won his races. Yeah.
So it's incremental. I mean, it is. We do live in a contentious democracy where you're not going to get 100% of everything, and you're going to have to fight. You're going to lose, and there's so much fear mongering to get people to choose a certain side and a certain narrative. That's always been the case with police violence, but things are changing, and I think that's where the organizers that have been doing the work for so long are able to capitalize on these moments where there are more people, there is more attention to say, here's the plan. Defunding the police is not some spontaneous protest.
No.
It's a detailed plan about changing resources and accountability. That's been done for years and years and years by people. In a moment like this, when history does show up, there is the opportunity to say and here's what we do now. So
we do it in other countries.
Always be optimistic about that.
They do it in.
Right. It's funny. I have to say, I went to Occupy a few times. It didn't particularly I respected it. I supported it. It didn't have the visceral call to me the way that Sanders' campaign did. But I do think that these things do, like you guys were saying, bubble up. Occupy didn't manifest in a particular campaign or candidate. But I think for people, it made talking about class much more palatable. I certainly think that I don't know. I was going to ask you guys about this, but how much Sanders inspired you? Because I think the biggest thing about Sanders was that he just mainstreamed outrage. He made it okay to be angry and made it okay to hope for more than the status quo, and reminded people or showed people it doesn't have to be this way. So
if you're not angry, you're not paying attention.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
And I don't know. So my apartment is 1 street over from where Bernie Sanders grew up. Literally in Brooklyn. I went to
near DeFaro's, right? The pizza place, DeFaro's. Yeah.
I went to Brooklyn College where Bernie went. I was at his rally when he kicked off his campaign. And the fact, like Pete said, he's been talking about this for 40 years. Somebody who's had the same message, talking about the same things, and was right when he was talking about them in the 70s, and is right now today. Yeah. That kind of level of commitment to being true to yourself and being willing to fight for somebody you don't know. That is what the military is supposedly about, is fighting for people you don't know. I raised my right hand. I have a lot of buddies who never made it home. I was willing to die for people in Oklahoma, Tennessee that I've never met, supposedly on the idea of freedom. So just having Bernie Sanders be consistent and talk about this, never changing his positions, consistency, talking about these same damn thing for the last 40 years, because the greatest tree you can ever plant is one whose shade you will never sit in. So somebody somewhere sacrificed for me, somebody in the 60s, in the 50s, when they marched, when they set at those counters, when they rode those buses down south, they sacrificed for little Isaiah James, who wasn't even here yet. It's the reason why I, as a 6'8" black man, can do what I do now. So my sacrifice is for some little kid who doesn't even know me, who isn't even born yet, but will reap the benefits of me planting this seed now. And they will sit in the shade of the tree of equality and justice that grows 30, 40 years from now. That's what got me into this race. And that's why when I look at Bernie Sanders, I'm like, that's my dude.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, I remember, I think I mentioned this earlier, but I was studying in grad school and I got in because of tenant organizing and sort of alternative equity models for housing. And I got to go up to Burlington back in 2012. And when Bernie was mayor back in the 80s, he helped start this community land trust, which basically separates kind of the speculative nature of the real estate, the land, from the actual housing structure. Still the largest one in the country. It's a deeply permanent, affordable housing model. And yeah, Bernie got this together with a bunch of activists, got some funding for it, and it's been wildly successful. Again, 35 years ago. Honestly, though, like when he launched in 2015, he had his little like paper he came out of the Capitol. I saw that and I was like, good for Bernie. That's cool.
Right.
Like, I'm gonna throw him some bucks. Like that'd be great. Like maybe he'll come in and muck it up. And then like he just sparked something that I'll be totally honest. Like, yeah, I was at Occupy. I've been doing lefty stuff for a long time. Not in a million years that I really think there was that kind of latent demand for those ideas. And certainly when he came so close, and again, talking to Isaiah earlier about like the voter suppression in New York City, allegedly blue state, that kind of wiped him out. That was really inspiring, and it did feel like things had changed. And I think for me more, it was even for AOC running, and I was the housing advisor on the campaign, knocking on doors and stuff, and seeing not just Bernie at that high level who's been doing it for 40 years, but somebody in our generation, somebody from a wildly different experience and community and a different voice, like win. And that was really inspiring, and saying like, hey, there's room for us here. And maybe not all of us are going to get through, but like people can. Like we can win.
That's their fear, Peter, because listen, before AOC who actually ran and won, they're like, oh, she's just another person running. But now she just won. Paula Jean Swearengin just won, in Kentucky. So now what the corporate Democrats are seeing are like, oh, damn, these people are starting to win. Even if they win 2 or 3 at a time, every 2 years, you got to think these corporate Democrats have been in there for 20, 30 years. So if we win 3 and 4 at a time, in the next, 10, 15 years, there'll be 40 or 50 of us in enough to actually move the needle and move the metric. So it's going to be a very big dichotomy when you have the Nancy Pelosi wing who's saying, yes, we should give corporations tax breaks, and 50 Democrats saying, no, we should provide money for schools. And now these people on the corporate side are going to have to answer to, wait, why are we giving the military industrial complex more money? Why aren't we giving schools more money? You know what I mean? So that's their fear. It's just like the Republicans in 2008. When they saw what happened with Obama, they're like, oh, wow, all these black people and all these young people voted, voter ID laws. They're doing that now. So they're like, you know what? That's why the DCCC blacklist came out. That's why all this other stuff came out, because they're scared.
Oh, that's right. We're blacklisted. I totally forgot about that.
Yeah.
I tried to contact the firm like the first month I was running. They're like, nope, we can't help you. You're running against the company.
I totally forgot about that. Yeah.
Well, thank you. This was so inspiring. I'm really glad that you guys could come on, and
this was very last minute.
Yeah, I know. This is totally last minute, guys. I mean, I literally pulled it together tonight.
9:47. You're like, can you be on at 10? I was like, you mean tonight?
Yeah.
I can be on.
Yeah. And by the way, Paula Jean and AOC, they both got the Katie Halper Show bump. So that's why, I'm the common denominator. I'm just kidding. But it's cool, because it's like, it's an exciting thing that there's so many candidates that are so exciting for leftists to support. And I just hope, whatever happens, I do think that I hope people remember that, it takes a while. So
wait, weren't all 3 of us at the Shaheed thing in Queens?
Yeah, we were. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were all at Shaheed's event.
Yeah. And I had Shahid on a couple of weeks ago. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool dude. I love Shaheed.
Yeah, he's really great. Yeah. Yeah.
But this is the last you'll see of either Pete or Isaiah.
What'd you say?
Sorry, what did you say? You'll see from either one of us. Either we win and get in there, because I guarantee you, if I don't win, my opponent's not going to change in 2 years. She's
right. Okay, so then what's next? What's next if it doesn't work? If you guys don't win?
If I don't win on June 23rd, June 24th, I start getting my team together.
Good. Okay, good.
Against her again. Like I said, she's not going to change.
Right, of course, yeah.
Interrupted. You know what I mean? So she's not going to change.
Girl interrupted.
So
yeah, I mean, I think too, like with the census, everybody fill out your census. They're going to be redistricting, and what that's going to look like. New York's going to lose at least 1 district, so these things are going to get even bigger and weirder. So there's a lot up in the air about that. But yeah, I mean, it's what has been cool, even for us as like leftists and sort of weird races. It's been inspiring to like recognize that there are a lot of awesome candidates out there that. We're not going anywhere, whether it's remounting in 2 years or doing something else or getting out of electoral politics, but getting back into organizing with a lot more people involved in this. It really is a very exciting time. And it just the urgency of this kind of action happening is really what's sustaining. Like, I'm on rent strike right now against my evil private equity firm, Blackstone. And like on June 24th, I'm still going to be on rent strike. People are still going to be struggling. So I'm going to take a week off and like go with my wife and like get out of town and not text anybody or call anybody. But I'll get back and we'll get right back to it. That's the work.
Yeah, I'm still going to do organizing and stuff like that. There's still veterans who don't have the services they need. There's still folks in my community. I see the same homeless people every year, which is a damn shame in New York City. So the work is not done. You know what I mean? So that's never going to happen. Like I said, the only thing I've ever quit was smoking. And thank God for that. But Isaiah does not quit. I don't do that.
Yeah. Well, great. Guys, thank you again so much. Any final points you want to make or websites you want to shout out or causes or anything?
I'll go for, I'm not even going to shout out my website. Folks can know IsaiahForCongress.com. I will. But I want to give folks, we're talking about policing and stuff, 4 books. The Oxford History of Prisons, and you can see they're all marked up. I read them all. The Black Silent Majority, which is, the Rockefeller drug laws. Michael Foucault's Discipline and Punishment. And this one. You must read this one, Rise of the Warrior Cop.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I want to have him on, yeah.
While we're in the damn position right now.
Yeah.
Read those books. And you will know. So just so you know, I'm not one of those ones who hopped on the.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Oh, I have one more question for you guys. There's been this like, what do you think of this discourse around like this is a bunch of white anarchists who are breaking windows. Have you guys, maybe this is just an online thing, but there's been this really annoying like white liberal, like left punching white liberal thing where they're like, oh, like maybe that white anarchists should sit with this one out. It's like a total like pseudo woke, but actually just totally invisibilizing all the people who are in this fight and protesting. And I don't know. Have you observed this at all? I can't really put it in.
I mean, all I saw on TV was like Louis Vuitton being looted and Nike.
Right.
I don't give a damn about Louis Vuitton.
Yeah, me neither. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not. You'll see my Twitter following is. I'm not extremely online, so I miss out on some of these things.
Yeah.
But that definitely narrative.
Or there's definitely. Sorry, I cut you off. Yes, keep going. Sorry.
No, just the narrative of like who's out there looting and rioting and all this noise. Like I've been saying this for number one. Like it's the responsibility of the police. The reason the protests exist because of police brutality. And like, they were obviously letting this stuff happen because the old playbook was always like, let a couple stores get rocked by some teenagers, and that'll make the white pearl clutching liberal like freak out about it. And that, again, the difference between online coverage and sort of like cable news coverage is it's not as yawning as it has been. It's still kind of there, but that narrative is harder for that to stick. So I do think that playbook doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, I've seen two. Sorry,
what was response to a man having his neck knelt on 8 minutes and 46 seconds is, oh my God, they broke into that.
Yeah, I know.
If that is your response to whatever's going on, you're part of the problem.
Right.
I don't know who you are. It should be, why are people out? Because people don't do this every day.
Right, of course, yeah.
But what are the conditions that led to this situation?
I know what they were.
It's the oppression of black and brown people in this entire country. If we had dealt with that, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. You keep black people in chains for 256 years, and then for another 100 years, we're not equal. And then maybe a store might get burnt down or two.
Right.
Maybe let's deal with these damn underlying conditions, and we won't have to deal with that.
Maybe it's the Russians, though. Have you heard that? Susan Rice told Wolf Blitzer that it's Russians sowing divide. Because Russians, they came here, they invented racism. I don't know if you know about that.
That is just a cop-out for our own goddamn failings dealing with our system. When they say it's Russian trolls online stoking, listen, I'm a black man. I've been stopped by the police for absolutely no reason. I've been assaulted by the police. Ain't no Russian have anything to do with that officer who slapped me in my face in front of my father. So so I don't give a damn. Nothing. The Russians had nothing to do when the police chased me and my brother because a white dude pointed at us and said we stole his wallet when I was 12 years old. Russians ain't have nothing to do with that. Before Russia even got the internet, dogs were biting black people on the ass in the rural South. Russians didn't have nothing to do with that. That's a cop-out for us not dealing with the underlying systematic racism that's in America.
I know. It's so offensive. Like, I've heard this before, but I thought that now they would pause it. I couldn't believe that it kept like I like Susan Rice said it to Wolf Blitzer. I was like, really now? Like we just saw a man who was killed again, had a guy kneeling on him for 8 minutes, and you're actually going to pretend it's a foreign intervention?
No, that's a cop out.
Yeah. Anyway, well, thank you guys so much, and good luck with everything. And I'll tweet out clips and release this and everything. It was great having you guys on. I really wish you luck.
Katie, really appreciate it, and thank you for all the work.
Best to you and your wife. Thank you, Katie, for having me on.
Thanks, guys. Come back.
Yeah, see you guys. Yeah, good luck, man.
Bye. That was fun.
I don't know how to
leave. That was inspiring. I know you come. It's hard to leave. You hate to quit me. All right. Proper discussion is not violence. Exactly. If I want to do one live stream at night, when should I do it? Thursday nights or Sunday nights, and at what time? Let me know. That was great. Very inspiring. Okay. Yeah. Did everyone sign up to my YouTube thing? You should do that. Pepto State, you're being very rude. You can be critical, but also, try to, what is it? Honey's better than vinegar or something. Anyway, you don't want to alienate people. Okay. This was great. See you guys next Sunday or Thursday. Anyone have any preferences for which night? Sunday night? Okay, we can keep it Sunday night. Maybe Sunday at 8 instead of 9. It's a little late, right? Although it's all different because whatever. It's summer, so later in the evenings is best. Okay. All right. And if anyone, let's see. If you want to reach me, you can tweet something under the tweet for this, I guess. Okay. And I'll get some mods and be better about all this stuff. All right. Bye, everyone. End broadcast.